There's a question that keeps surfacing in certain music circles. It does not come up in mainstream conversations. It is not discussed in most music classrooms. But among researchers, instrument historians, and a small number of musicians who have gone deep into the archives, this question refuses to go away. And what makes it particularly interesting is that the more carefully you examine it, the less certain the answer becomes. The question is simple on the surface. What pitch was music actually tuned to before the modern standard was set? And why does the answer seem so difficult to find? To understand why this matters, it helps to start at the beginning. Sound, at its most basic level, is vibration. When a string on a violin is plucked, it moves back and forth through the air at a specific speed. That speed is measured in cycles per second, and in modern terminology, it is referred to as hertz. The note we call A, the one that orchestras use as their reference point before every performance, vibrates at a specific number of cycles per second. That number determines whether the music sounds higher or lower. It determines the overall color and character of the sound. And for most of recorded modern history, that number has been fixed at 440. But it was not always 440. And this is where things start to become unclear. In 1939, a formal international agreement was reached in London. Representatives from multiple countries came together and decided that the note A would be standardized at exactly 440 hertz. The goal was practical and reasonable. Before this agreement, different countries, different cities, and even different orchestras were using slightly different tuning references. A musician traveling from one country to another might find that the instruments were tuned just slightly higher or lower than what they were used to. This created problems. It made international collaboration more complicated than it needed to be. So a standard was agreed upon, and from that point forward, 440 hertz became the official reference pitch for Western music. For most people, this is where the story ends. A practical problem was identified. A logical solution was applied. Music moved forward in a more organized way. And on the surface, there is nothing strange about that. Standardization happens across many fields, and in most cases, it is welcomed as progress. But this is where it becomes unclear. When researchers began looking closely at instruments that survived from centuries before this agreement, something did not quite add up. The violins, cellos, lutes, and harpsichords built during the 1600s and 1700s were not designed for 440 hertz. This can be determined by studying their physical construction. The thickness of their strings, the tension their wooden bodies were built to handle, the spacing and design of their components. All of these things point toward a different tuning reference, a lower one. Instruments from this period appear to have been built for a pitch that sits somewhere below the modern standard. And in some cases, the difference is not small enough to ignore. This raises a question that is harder to dismiss than it first appears. If 440 was the standard set in 1939, what exactly were musicians working with before that? And if the answer is simply that tuning was less consistent in earlier centuries, why do the old instruments seem to cluster around something noticeably lower, rather than being scattered randomly above and below the modern standard? Some researchers have pointed to historical records that suggest certain periods of music history used a tuning reference closer to 432 hertz. Others place the earlier standard even lower, somewhere in the range of 415 or 417 hertz, particularly for music from the Baroque era. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the historical record is not clean. There was no single agreed-upon pitch across all of Europe during the 1600s and 1700s. Tuning varied by region, by era, and even by individual instrument maker. So making any broad statement about what pitch was universally used before 1939 is complicated by the fact that no such universal pitch existed, and yet the instruments remain, and they suggest something. When you look at a violin made by one of the great Italian craftsmen of the 17th century, you are looking at an object that was built with extraordinary precision. These were not rough or approximate creations. The makers understood acoustics, materials, and resonance at a level that modern researchers still study closely. The decisions they made about thickness, tension, and construction were not accidental. So when those same instruments show signs of being designed for a lower tuning, it is reasonable to ask whether that was intentional, whether there was something about that lower frequency that these craftsmen were working toward? Some believe the answer is yes. There's a line of thinking, not widely accepted in mainstream musicology, but present in certain research circles, that suggests lower tuning frequencies interact with the physical properties of wood and string differently than higher ones. That instruments tuned lower may produce a slightly different quality of resonance. Whether this is measurable or meaningful is a matter of disagreement. The evidence is not conclusive, but the observation that old instruments seem built for something different than the current standard is not something that can simply be brushed aside. At first, this seems like a minor technical matter. A few hertz here or there does not sound like something that would have significant consequences, and perhaps it does not. But this is exactly why the question is difficult, because the difference in pitch between 432 and 440 hertz is small enough that most listeners would not consciously notice it in an isolated moment. Yet it is large enough that instruments built for one standard do not perform at their best when forced into the other. Musicians who have experimented with retuning modern instruments to lower frequencies sometimes describe a different quality of sound, a slightly warmer or more open resonance. Others hear no meaningful difference at all. The debate remains unresolved. And this leads to another layer of the question. Why 440 specifically? The 1939 agreement was not the first attempt at standardization. Earlier proposals had suggested different numbers. Some proposals recommended 432. Others suggested 435, which had been used as a reference in parts of Europe during the late 19th century. The selection of 440 was not based on a single undisputed scientific principle. It was the result of a process involving compromise, practical considerations, and the preferences of the organizations involved, which means the number itself was not inevitable. A different set of circumstances might have produced a different standard. This does not mean the current standard is wrong. It simply means it was chosen, not discovered. And that distinction opens up questions about whether other choices might have led to different outcomes, not just practically, but in terms of how music has sounded for the past several decades. What is harder to determine is how much of this matters in practice. Music has functioned effectively under the 440 standard for nearly a century. Major orchestras, recording studios, instrument manufacturers, and musicians around the world have built their work around this reference. Changing it now would create enormous logistical difficulties. So even if there were clear evidence that an earlier standard had certain advantages, the question of what to do with that information would be its own complicated problem. But this is where it becomes useful to separate two things. One is the practical question of what pitch music should use going forward. The other is the historical question of what pitch music actually used in the past, and whether that history has been fully understood. These are different questions. And the second one, the historical one, is the one that seems to have incomplete answers. The gap between the old instruments and the modern standard is real. It can be measured. It can be observed. What is not fully clear is what it means, how it came to exist, and whether the transition from earlier tuning practices to 440 Hz was as straightforward as the official record suggests. The 1939 agreement is documented, but the full picture of what existed before it, and why the shift from earlier pitches to the modern standard happened the way it did, is something that researchers are still trying to piece together. And this is where the investigation begins, not with dramatic claims or strong conclusions, but with a gap in the record that is difficult to fully explain. Old instruments that suggest one thing, a modern standard that reflects another, and a history of tuning practices that is more complicated and more uncertain than most people realize. The question is not whether the standard should change. The question is whether we fully understand how it was set in the first place. And the more carefully you look at the evidence, the less certain that answer becomes. The official explanation for why music is tuned the way it is today sounds reasonable when you first hear it. Before 1939, there was no single agreed-upon pitch standard across the world. Different countries were using different tuning references. Different orchestras within the same country sometimes disagreed with each other. A musician who trained in one city and then traveled to perform in another might find that the instruments there were tuned slightly higher or lower than what they were accustomed to. It was not a catastrophic problem, but it was a persistent and inconvenient one. And over time, As international performances and recordings became more common, that inconsistency became harder to ignore. To understand how significant this was, it helps to think about what tuning actually means in a practical context. When an orchestra prepares to perform, every instrument needs to be aligned to the same reference point. If one section is tuned slightly higher than another, the result is a sound that feels unstable, not necessarily unpleasant in a dramatic way, but slightly off, slightly unclear. For professional musicians working at a high level, this kind of misalignment is something they notice immediately. And before any international standard existed, this misalignment was not occasional. It was the default condition whenever musicians from different places came together. So the pressure to establish a universal standard was genuine. It did not come from nowhere. As the 19th century moved into the 20th, more orchestras were touring internationally. More recordings were being made and distributed across borders. The need for a common reference point was becoming more practical and more urgent. The question was not really whether a standard was needed. The question was which number to choose. This is where the official story begins to feel slightly less complete. In 1939, delegates gathered in London under the International Standards Association. They reviewed the available options, considered the tuning practices already in use across various countries, and reached an agreement. The Note A would be standardized at 440 Hz. The reasoning, as it has been recorded, was that this number fell within a reasonable range of what many major orchestras were already using. It was described as a compromise, a central point that could bring together the various regional practices without forcing any single tradition to change too dramatically. After the agreement was signed, the standard moved through music infrastructure fairly quickly. Radio broadcasters adopted it. Recording studios built their calibration around it. Instrument manufacturers began producing to this specification. Music education systems incorporated it into how they taught students to tune. Within a relatively short period, 440 Hz became the invisible foundation underneath almost all of Western music. Most people who grew up learning music after this period simply accepted it as a fact of nature, not realizing it was the result of a specific decision made at a specific moment in time. And on the surface, the logic holds. There was a problem. A solution was proposed. The solution was adopted. The problem was resolved. This is how standardization is supposed to work, and in most fields, this kind of story does not invite much further investigation. But this is where it becomes unclear. When you begin looking at the details of what existed before 1939, the explanation starts to feel like it is leaving certain things out. The narrative presents the pre-standardization period as one of general inconsistency, with no clear center. Different pitches being used in different places, with no particular pattern. But the historical record suggests something more complicated than that. While it is true that tuning was not uniform across the world before 1939, it was not entirely random either. There were patterns. There were regional tendencies. And some of those tendencies pointed toward pitches that were noticeably lower than 440. For much of the 19th century, a reference pitch of around 435 Hz was commonly used across parts of Europe. This number had enough adoption that it was formalized in France in 1859, when the French government officially set 435 as their national standard. Other countries followed similar practices, though with some variation. The point is that there was already movement towards standardization before 1939. It was not a complete free-for-all, and the pitches being discussed and used during this earlier period were, in most cases, lower than the number that was eventually chosen. This raises a question that the official explanation does not fully answer. If the pre-existing tendencies in European music pointed toward something closer to 435, why did the 1939 agreement land on 440? The stated reason is that it represented a compromise among existing practices. But a compromise between what and what? If many orchestras were already working near 435, and some were working slightly higher, a true compromise might have been expected to land somewhere in between. Instead, the final number sits above what appears to have been the more common reference point of the preceding century. Some researchers have noted that certain orchestras, particularly some American ones, had already been using pitches at or near 440 before the 1939 agreement. This may help explain part of the shift. As American musical institutions grew in influence and size during the early 20th century, their practices may have carried more weight in the international conversation. But this explanation, while plausible, is also not fully documented. It is a reasonable inference, not a clearly recorded fact. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the written record of how and why 440 was chosen over other numbers is not as detailed as one might expect for a decision of this significance. At first, it seems like a minor gap. A number was chosen, reasons were given, the world moved on. But the absence of a clear, fully documented explanation for why 440 specifically became the standard is something that researchers have noted more than once. The minutes from the 1939 London Conference exist, but they do not provide a detailed account of the deliberations. They record the outcome without fully explaining the path that led to it. And this leaves room for questions that are difficult to answer with certainty. There is also the matter of timing. The 1939 agreement was reached in May of that year. Within months, the world would be at war. The disruptions that followed meant that the standard, while formally agreed upon, was not immediately implemented in a coordinated global way. Some countries continued using their own references for years afterward. The widespread adoption of 440 happened gradually, driven more by the spread of American recording and broadcasting infrastructure than by a single coordinated transition. This is not a suspicious observation on its own, but it does mean that the story of how 440 became universal is less clean than the official account suggests. What the official explanation does well is establish that standardization was necessary, and that the process involved legitimate institutions working toward a practical goal. None of that is in question. What it does less well is explain why the specific number 440 was selected rather than something slightly lower, like 432 or 435, which had more historical precedent in the preceding century. This is not a small gap. The difference between 432 and 440 may seem minor in numerical terms, but the question of why one was chosen over the other matters if you are trying to understand the full history of how music arrived at its current form. Some believe that the choice of 440 was shaped by technological factors, that certain early broadcasting equipment and recording devices functioned more reliably at this frequency. Others disagree, arguing that the difference was too small to create meaningful technical advantages. The debate is not resolved. The documentation that might settle it is not easily accessible, and in some cases may not have survived the disruptions of the war years. And this is what makes the accepted version feel incomplete. It is not that the explanation is wrong. It is that it answers only part of the question. It explains that a standard was needed, and that one was chosen. It does not fully explain why that particular number was the one that prevailed. And when you look at the broader history of tuning, the instruments from earlier centuries, the European standards that preceded 1939, the gradual drift upward in pitch that can be traced across the 18th and 19th centuries, the question of how and why we arrived specifically at 440 becomes harder to dismiss. The accepted version is the version most people learn, and for most practical purposes, it is sufficient. But for those who look more closely at the details, it raises more questions than it resolves. And those questions are exactly where the next part of this investigation leads. This is where the first real doubt appears. Not a dramatic contradiction, not a hidden conspiracy, just a detail that, when examined carefully, does not quite fit the explanation that has been given. And once you notice it, it is difficult to look past. The official story of the 1939 standardization acknowledges that pitch was inconsistent before that agreement. This is accurate. The historical record does confirm that different regions used different tuning references, and that there was no single universal standard during the centuries before the London Conference. On this point, there is no dispute, but the official account treats this inconsistency as a kind of formless variation, pitches scattered in different directions with no particular center. And this is where the story starts to feel incomplete, because when you actually look at what those historical pitches were, a pattern begins to emerge, and that pattern points in a specific direction. To follow this, it helps to look at what is actually documented about pitch across different periods of European music history. In many parts of Europe, during the 1700s, The reference pitch for the note A was commonly found in the range of 415 Hz. Some regions used pitches around 420 or 422. Others were closer to 430. Church organs, which were large permanent installations built to last for generations, were frequently tuned to pitches even lower than these. There were local exceptions, and tuning did vary from place to place. But the variation was not random. The numbers, across many different sources and many different regions, tend to cluster below 435, and they cluster meaningfully below 440. This is a detail worth pausing on, because if the historical pitch for A in European music was generally sitting somewhere between 415 and 430 for most of the 1700s, that is not a minor difference from 440. It is a gap of 10 to 25 Hz. In musical terms, depending on where within that range you measure, this approaches what musicians would describe as nearly a semitone, a full step on a piano keyboard. That is not a small technical difference. That is an audible shift in the overall pitch of the music. And this is where it becomes unclear, because the official justification for choosing 440 was that it represented a compromise, a central value within the range of pitches that were already being used. This explanation only holds if 440 actually sits near the center of that range. But if the historical average across centuries of Western classical music was somewhere closer to 415 or 430, then 440 is not the center of anything. It sits above the upper edge of the range that was in use for most of recorded Western music history. That is not what a compromise looks like. That is a significant shift in one direction. The question this raises is straightforward, but difficult to answer. Why was 440 chosen if the historical record suggests the center of actual practice was noticeably lower? The explanations that have been offered over the years are various and not entirely satisfying. Some point to the practices of certain American orchestras, which had been using higher tuning references during the early 20th century. Some suggest that there were practical advantages in terms of the technology of early recording and broadcasting. Others argue simply that the delegates at the 1939 conference were working from a limited picture of what historical pitch actually looked like. None of these explanations is entirely without merit, but none of them fully closes the gap either. At first, it seems like a disagreement about numbers, and perhaps that is all it is. But there is another dimension to this that makes the question more significant. The great works of the Western classical tradition, the symphonies, the concertos, the operas, the chamber pieces that form the foundation of this musical heritage, were composed and performed at these lower pitches. This is not a minor point. When Vivaldi wrote his concertos, he heard them performed at the pitch his instruments were built for. When Bach composed his cantatas and orchestral suites, his musicians tuned to the references available to them in their region and time. When Mozart and Haydn wrote their symphonies, those works were realized at frequencies that sat well below the modern standard. This means that the music we hear today, when performed at 440 Hz, is being heard at a pitch that its composers never experienced. The overall sound sits higher than what those composers intended, or at least higher than what was physically possible with the instruments of their time. Whether this changes the music in a meaningful way is debated. Some argue that the relative relationships between notes are what matter, and those relationships are preserved regardless of the overall pitch level. Others suggest that the actual frequency of sound is qualities that matter beyond its relative position, that the physical vibration of the air at a certain frequency has characteristics that are not simply about high or low in isolation. This debate is not settled. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because even if you set aside the question of whether the frequency itself matters beyond pitch relationships, there is still the question of what the instruments were built to do. The surviving instruments from the Baroque and Classical periods were not designed for 440. They were designed for something lower. Their strings, their bodies, their resonant properties were calibrated for a different tuning environment. When those instruments are played at modern pitch, adjustments have to be made, and those adjustments alter things. Not dramatically, not in ways that most audiences would notice, but measurably. The physical relationship between the instrument and the pitch it was built for is changed. Some researchers and musicians working in the field of historically informed performance have been grappling with this for decades. The early music movement, which developed during the second half of the 20th century, made a point of trying to recreate the original performance conditions of earlier periods. This included tuning to lower pitches, using instruments built to historical specifications, and following performance practices documented in sources from the relevant era. Their work has produced a substantial body of evidence about what music from the 1600s and 1700s actually sounded like in its original context. And that evidence consistently points toward a pitch environment that was lower than the modern standard. What is harder to determine is exactly how much lower. The historical record is not perfectly uniform. Different sources from the same period sometimes suggest different pitches. The instruments that have survived may have been modified over the centuries. Organs that were tuned at specific pitches in the 18th century may have been altered during later renovations. So while the general direction of the evidence is consistent, towards something lower than 440, the exact numbers are not always clear. Pinning down a single historical average with precision is not straightforward, and yet the pattern is real. It is documented. It is measurable enough that researchers can speak about it with reasonable confidence. The pitch of A in European music, for most of the period during which the great classical works were composed, was somewhere in a range that sits meaningfully below the number that was selected in 1939 and called a compromise. This does not mean the 1939 decision was made in bad faith. It does not require any assumption of deliberate distortion. It is possible that the delegates working in London had a genuinely incomplete picture of historical practice. It is possible that the records available to them emphasized more recent European pitches, which had been rising gradually through the 19th century, rather than the broader historical average. It is possible that practical considerations about current instrument manufacturing and broadcasting technology carried more weight than historical precedent. All of these possibilities are reasonable. But what remains difficult to explain is the specific claim that 440 was a compromise, reflecting the center of existing practice. Because when you look at the actual numbers across the historical record, that claim does not fully hold. The center of existing practice, measured across centuries rather than just the preceding decades, sits in a noticeably different place. The justification given for the number selected does not match the evidence as clearly as the official version suggests. And this is the doubt that this chapter leaves open. Not a conclusion, not a claim about what should have happened differently. Just a specific, observable gap between what the historical record shows and what the official explanation states. The range of historical pitch was not centered on 440. The great composers of the Western tradition did not hear their music at 440. The instruments of those centuries were not built for 440. And the reasons why the selection landed there, rather than somewhere within the range where most of that history actually took place, have not been explained in a way that fully accounts for these facts. The question of why 440 specifically remains open, and as this investigation continues, that question becomes more important, not less. To understand why the gap between historical pitch and the modern standard matters, it helps to go further back, not just to 1939, and not just to the decades immediately before it, further back than that, to a time when the question of tuning was not an international concern, not a subject for conferences or formal agreements, but simply a local decision made by individual musicians, instrument builders, and the institutions that employed them. For most of recorded musical history, pitch was exactly that, a local matter. When a church commissioned an organ, the instrument was built to whatever pitch the builder and the congregation agreed upon. When a royal court employed musicians, those musicians tuned to whatever reference the court had established, which might differ from the reference used by the court in the next region or even the next city. When traveling performers moved from place to place, they adjusted their instruments to match wherever they were playing. There was no expectation of consistency across borders. There was no body with the authority to impose one. Music existed within local communities, and tuning was part of that local context. This arrangement worked well enough for centuries. It created variation, but that variation was not experienced as a problem in the way it would later become. A musician in Leipzig did not need to be perfectly aligned with a musician in Venice. They existed in different musical worlds, serving different audiences and different institutions. The idea that all of Western music should share a single tuning reference would have been difficult to imagine, let alone implement. But by the 1800s, something began to shift. And understanding this shift is important, because it is the background against which the 1939 decision has to be understood. Orchestras were growing. Through the 18th century, orchestral ensembles had been relatively modest in size. By the mid-19th century, they had expanded significantly. More musicians, more instruments, more complex and demanding repertoire. This expansion brought new pressures. A larger orchestra required greater internal consistency. If different sections were tuned even slightly differently, the resultant scale was a sound that felt unstable and unfocused. Instrument manufacturing was also changing. Factories were beginning to produce instruments in larger quantities for wider distribution. This industrialization of instrument making created an incentive for standardization. A manufacturer producing instruments across a large region needed a reference that all of their customers could share. At the same time, travel and communication between countries were becoming faster and more practical. International performances were no longer rare. Musicians and ensembles were crossing borders more regularly. The inconsistency in tuning between regions was becoming a more frequent and more visible problem. It was in this environment that the first serious official attempts at standardization began to appear. In 1859, France made an early and significant move. The French government issued a formal decree establishing the note A at 435 Hz. This was not simply a recommendation from a music organization or an informal agreement between orchestras. It was a government decree, a legally established national standard. It was one of the first times any country had taken that kind of official step on the question of musical pitch, and it sent a signal to the rest of the musical world that this question was serious enough to be treated as a matter of public policy. Other countries paid attention. The French standard of 435 was observed, discussed, and in many cases, informally adopted by musicians and institutions across Europe who found it to be a reasonable reference. It was not universally followed, and enforcement beyond French borders was not possible. But 435 had gained a degree of credibility simply by virtue of being officially declared. It became a reference point in conversations that would continue for decades. This is where the timeline becomes particularly interesting. In 1885, an international conference was convened in Vienna to address the pitch question on a broader level. Representatives from multiple countries came together to discuss whether a shared European standard could be agreed upon, and the number that emerged from those discussions as a reasonable reference was, again, 435. Not unanimously, not without debate, but 435 was the number that most of the participating nations found acceptable. It was close to what many of them were already using. It had the credibility of the French decree behind it, and it sat within a range that was consistent with the broader historical practice of European music up to that point. So by the end of the 19th century, the direction of the conversation was clear. Decades of discussion, formal and informal, had been moving toward a number in the region of 435. This was the center of gravity for the standardization effort. This was where the momentum was pointing. And then, within a few decades, the final standard landed at 440. At first, this seems like a small adjustment. 5 Hz is not a large number in isolation. If you heard two notes separated by 5 Hz without any other reference, you might struggle to identify the difference consciously. So it is reasonable to wonder whether this gap is actually significant enough to raise questions. But this is where the context matters. The shift from 435 to 440 was not a random fluctuation. It went in a specific direction. It moved away from the historical center of European practice, not toward it. And it moved away from the number that had been the focal point of international discussion for the better part of a century. In acoustics, 5 Hz is not nothing. The relationship between frequencies means that a difference of 5 Hz at the level of A affects every other note in the scale proportionally. The whole system shifts, and while the shift may not be dramatic to an untrained ear in a single listening moment, it is consistent and cumulative. Every piece of music performed at 440 instead of 435 is being heard in a slightly different tonal environment than it would have been at the earlier standard. Whether this matters perceptually is debated, but the fact that the shift happened, and happened in a direction away from the historical norm, is not easily dismissed. The reasoning given for moving from 435 to 440 is less detailed than one might expect for a decision of this consequence. Some accounts point to the influence of certain American orchestras that had adopted higher tuning references during the early 20th century. American musical institutions had grown considerably in scale and prestige by this period, and their practices carried weight in international discussions. If influential American ensembles were already tuning at or near 440, this may have shaped what the delegates in London considered a reasonable compromise in 1939. But this explanation, even if partially accurate, is not fully documented. The available records from the 1939 conference do not provide a detailed account of how 440 was arrived at rather than 435 or some other number nearby. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because what exists in the record is the outcome. 440 was chosen, without a fully transparent account of the deliberation that produced it. The reasoning offered publicly was that 440 represented a compromise within the existing range. But as has already been examined, the existing range of historical practice did not have its center at 440. It had its center considerably lower, and the international discussion that had been building for decades pointed toward 435, not higher. Some believe the upward shift was driven by practical factors in the emerging recording and broadcasting industries. Early audio technology had certain characteristics that may have favored higher frequencies for reasons related to equipment sensitivity and transmission quality. Others disagree with this interpretation, arguing that the technical differences were too small to justify a meaningful preference. The debate has not been resolved with clear documentation on either side. What is observable is the pattern. Pitch, across the 18th and 19th centuries, had been gradually drifting upward in certain parts of Europe, particularly in contexts where orchestras were competing for a brighter, more powerful sound. Higher tuning gives string instruments in particular a slightly more brilliant quality, and in large concert halls, this was sometimes seen as an advantage. So there was a natural pressure in certain circles toward higher pitch, independent of any formal agreement. Whether this pressure was a primary factor in the final selection of 440 is not clearly established, but it was present. What is harder to explain is why this upward pressure was allowed to define a universal standard, when the formal international discussions of the preceding century had been pointing toward a number more consistent with the historical average. The 1885 Vienna Conference had moved toward 435. The French standard was 435. The historical practice of the centuries before that was even lower, and yet the final answer in 1939 was 440. The gap between where the discussion had been heading and where it ended up is real. It is documented, and the reasoning that bridges that gap, the explanation for why 440 specifically, rather than the number the preceding century of discussion had favored, is not as clear or detailed as the significance of the decision would seem to require. This is not a conclusion. It is an observation. The timeline has a shift in it. The shift moved in a specific direction, and the explanation for that shift remains incomplete in ways that are difficult to simply accept and move past. When you examine the 1939 Standardization Agreement closely, one of the first things that becomes apparent is that the process itself was not as straightforward as it is usually described. The outcome is presented as an international consensus, a shared decision reached by the global musical community. And in a formal sense, there was an agreement. A number was chosen. Documents were signed. But when you look at the specific circumstances surrounding that meeting, who was there, who was not, and what was happening in the world at that precise moment, the picture becomes considerably more complicated. The London Conference took place in May of 1939. To understand why this timing matters, it is necessary to remember what Europe looked like at that point. The continent was in a state of extreme political tension. The events that would lead to the Second World War were already well underway. Germany had already annexed Austria and occupied Czechoslovakia. The political relationships between European nations were fractured in ways that had direct consequences for international cooperation of any kind. Sending representatives to a conference in London, or accepting the results of such a conference, was not a neutral act for every country. The political context shaped who could participate and how freely they could do so. Some researchers who have examined the composition of the 1939 meeting have noted that the participation was uneven. Not every nation with a significant musical tradition was fully and equally represented. Some major European musical countries had complicated or strained relationships with the host nation and with international institutions more broadly at that moment. This does not mean the conference was illegitimate. It was organized by a recognized international body, and the delegates who attended were genuine representatives of their respective nations. But it does mean that the agreement that emerged was narrower in its actual representation than the word international would typically suggest. The standard was described as a global consensus, but the room in which it was decided did not contain the full breadth of the global musical community. This is a detail that does not appear in most standard accounts of how 440 became the universal pitch. The explanation that is usually given focuses on the technical and practical reasoning for the choice of number, not on the question of who exactly was in the room when that choice was made. And this is where it becomes unclear, because these two things are not unrelated. The composition of the group making a decision can shape what decision gets made. If certain voices were absent or underrepresented, the outcome may reflect a narrower set of preferences than a truly universal agreement would have produced. After the war, the musical world was in a different position. The disruptions of the conflict had interrupted the implementation of the 1939 standard in many regions. Some countries had continued using their own tuning references during the war years, either out of habit or because the infrastructure to enforce a new standard simply did not exist. The question of pitch standardization had to be revisited, and so in 1955, the International Organization for Standardization took up the matter formally. After reviewing the 1939 agreement and the state of tuning practices across member nations at that time, they confirmed A at 440 Hz as the international standard. The number from 1939 was reaffirmed. Then, in 1975, it was reconfirmed again. A second formal reaffirmation of the same number, 2 decades after the first post-war confirmation. On the surface, this looks like a story of growing consensus. The standard was set, then confirmed again. Each step reinforces the legitimacy of the number. But there's another way to read this timeline. Each reconfirmation also implies that the previous agreement had not been complete enough to make the reconfirmation unnecessary. If the 1939 agreement had been truly universal and fully adopted, a formal reconfirmation in 1955 would not have been needed. If the 1955 confirmation had settled the matter entirely, there would have been no need to revisit it again in 1975. The repeated reaffirmations suggest that adoption of the standard was slower and more contested than the official narrative tends to acknowledge. This raises a question that is not often asked in accounts of this history. If the standard was internationally agreed upon in 1939, why did it require 2 additional rounds of formal confirmation over the following 4 decades? What was happening in the gaps between these agreements? Which countries or institutions were not fully aligned with 440, and why? These questions do not have easy answers in the publicly available record, but the fact that the reconfirmations were considered necessary is itself a piece of information about how contested the standard actually was in practice. And this is where another layer of the story becomes relevant. The question of who held practical influence over the adoption of the standard is not just a political question. It is also an industrial one. By the mid-20th century, the music industry was no longer simply about live performance. Recording technology had transformed how music was produced, distributed, and heard. Radio broadcasting had made it possible to transmit music to millions of people simultaneously. And the companies and countries that controlled this technology had enormous practical influence over what musical standards actually took hold in everyday life, regardless of what international conferences had formally agreed upon. At first, this seems like a separate issue. Technical standards and political agreements operate through different mechanisms, but this is where the two become connected. The recording and broadcasting industries of the mid-20th century were heavily concentrated in specific countries and, within those countries, in specific companies. The United States had emerged from the Second World War with its industrial infrastructure intact and its cultural output expanding rapidly. American recording studios, American radio networks, and American instrument manufacturers were producing and distributing music at a scale that few other countries could match. And many of these American institutions were already operating at or near 440 before the 1939 conference had taken place. This creates an interesting dynamic. If the dominant producers of recorded music were already using 440, then the practical adoption of 440 as a global standard was not simply a result of the 1939 agreement. It was also a result of market influence. Countries and institutions that wanted their recordings to be compatible with the most widely distributed music in the world had a practical incentive to align with whatever standard the dominant producers were using. This is a form of standardization that operates below the level of formal agreements, through economic and technological pressure rather than deliberate consensus. Whether this influence was a significant factor in why 440 was chosen at the 1939 conference, rather than 435 or some other number closer to the historical average, is not clearly documented. The available records do not include a detailed account of how the deliberations proceeded or which arguments carried the most weight. What is known is that American musical practices favored higher tuning references during the early 20th century, and that American institutional influence on the international music industry was substantial by the time the London Conference took place. Whether these facts are connected in a direct and documented way, or whether the connection is inferential, is a distinction that honest examination requires acknowledging. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the standard historical account of the 1939 standardization focuses almost entirely on the formal, institutional process. It describes a conference, a deliberation, and an agreement. What it does not explore in any meaningful detail is the background context of who held influence, what interests were at stake, and how the concentration of recording and broadcasting power may have shaped what was considered a reasonable standard. These are not fringe questions. They are the kinds of questions that historians ask about any significant international agreement, but they are notably absent from most explanations of how 440 came to be the universal pitch. Some researchers have raised these points and been met with responses suggesting that the scale of the decision does not warrant this level of scrutiny, that it was, after all, just a choice about pitch. But this response misses something. The decision established the tuning environment for all recorded music for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Every piece of music produced in studios, broadcast on radio, taught in schools, and performed in concert halls around the world has been shaped by this number. The reach of that decision is not small, and the process by which it was made, if it was shaped by uneven participation and concentrated industrial influence, rather than true universal consensus, is worth understanding clearly. What the repeated reconfirmations in 1955 and 1975 suggest, when read carefully, is that the standard was not as settled as it appeared. Countries and institutions continued to work through the implications of aligning with 440, and the formal bodies felt it necessary to reassert the standard more than once. This pattern does not prove that 440 was the wrong choice or that any deliberate manipulation was involved, but it does suggest that the story of how this number became universal is more layered, more contested, and less cleanly resolved than the standard explanation presents. And the factor that is most consistently absent from that explanation, the role of industrial concentration and the practical influence of the dominant recording and broadcasting powers, is precisely the factor that would be most relevant to understanding why the final number ended up where it did, rather than where a century of prior international discussion had been pointing. That absence is itself something worth examining, and it is something this investigation is not yet finished with. At a certain point in this investigation, the questions stop being purely historical. They stop being about conference records and political contexts and undocumented deliberations. They become physical, measurable, present in objects that still exist today and can be examined directly. And this is where the evidence becomes considerably harder to set aside. The old violins are still here. Not all of them, but enough. Instruments built in the workshops of northern Italy during the 1600s and 1700s have survived in museums, in private collections, and in the hands of performing musicians around the world. These are not rough or approximate objects. They were made by craftsmen who understood wood, acoustics, and string tension at a level that modern researchers continue to study closely. Every decision in their construction, the thickness of the top plate, the curvature of the back, the height and angle of the neck, the internal bracing that supports the body from the inside, was deliberate. These were not decorative objects. They were precision instruments built to produce sound in a specific way, under specific physical conditions. And when instrument makers and acoustics researchers examine these old violins carefully, they find something consistent, something that appears across instruments from different makers, different regions, and different decades within that period. The construction of these instruments does not match what would be required to sustain modern pitch over time. More specifically, the physical structure of these old instruments suggests they were built for a lower string tension than 440 Hz tuning would impose on them. To understand why this matters, it helps to think about what string tension actually does to a violin. When a string is tuned to a higher pitch, it must be pulled tighter. A tighter string exerts more force on the instrument, on the bridge, on the top plate, on the internal structure that holds everything together. Over time, and especially over the course of years or decades, this tension affects the wood. It stresses the joints. It can alter the shape of the body. An instrument built to withstand a certain level of tension will perform well within that range, but if subjected to significantly greater tension over long periods, it will show signs of strain. The wood is not infinitely flexible. It responds to the forces placed upon it. In the old instruments from the 1600s and 1700s, researchers have consistently found that the wood in certain critical areas is thinner than what modern construction would use for an instrument intended for 440 Hz. The internal bracing, the strips and blocks of wood fitted inside the body to reinforce it, is lighter than what would typically be specified for modern pitch. And the neck, the long piece of wood that extends from the body and supports the strings along its length, is set at an angle that reflects a different relationship with string tension than modern instruments are built for. These are not isolated observations from a single instrument. They appear as a pattern across many instruments from this period. But this is where it becomes unclear, because many of the most famous old violins in the world are no longer in their original configuration. They have been modified. The necks of many historical instruments were reset at steeper angles during the 19th century, when orchestral pitch was rising and performers needed their instruments to project more powerfully in larger concert halls. Internal bracing was strengthened in some instruments. Other structural adjustments were made to allow these instruments to function at higher tensions without damage. These modifications are documented. They are acknowledged by instrument historians and museum curators. They are not hidden, but the fact that the modifications were necessary is itself the point. An instrument that did not need modification would not have been modified. The very existence of these documented changes confirms that the original construction was not designed for the tension that modern pitch requires. The craftsmen who built these instruments in the 17th and 18th centuries made specific structural choices, and those choices were later found to be incompatible with higher tuning. The response was to alter the instruments rather than to lower the pitch back to where the instruments were built to perform. At first, this seems like a straightforward practical decision. Music had moved to a higher standard. Old instruments needed to be adapted to remain functional. This is how tools are often updated when the context around them changes. But there is a question embedded in this practical story that does not get answered simply by noting that modifications were made. The question is what the original makers were optimizing for. These craftsmen were not working casually or approximately. The violin makers of Cremona, in particular, the region in northern Italy where many of the most celebrated instruments of this period were produced, were operating within a tradition of extraordinary precision and accumulated knowledge. Their understanding of how wood vibrates, how different thicknesses affect resonance, and how structural choices shape the sound of an instrument was deep and carefully developed. When they made a decision about how thick to cut a top plate, or how to angle a neck, or how much internal reinforcement to include. They were not guessing. They were applying knowledge that had been refined across generations of instrument making. So when their instruments consistently show construction that is calibrated for lower string tension, the reasonable interpretation is that this was intentional. They were building for the pitch they were working with. The lighter construction was not a limitation or an oversight. It was a design choice that reflected the acoustic environment of their time. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Because if the construction was deliberate, and if it reflects a specific and intentional relationship between the instrument's physical structure and the pitch it was built for, then it raises a deeper question. What were those craftsmen optimizing for, beyond simply matching the pitch of their era? Some researchers believe the answer has to do with resonance. The way a wooden instrument vibrates is not uniform across all frequencies. Different pitches interact with the physical properties of wood differently. The thickness and stiffness of the wood, the size and shape of the body, and the tension of the strings all contribute to a complex acoustic relationship that determines how efficiently the instrument converts string vibration into sound. There's a line of thinking, not universally accepted but present in serious acoustics research, that the construction of the old instruments was optimized for a specific resonant relationship, one that worked most effectively at the lower pitches those craftsmen were using, and one that is subtly compromised when those same instruments are pushed to modern pitch. Whether this can be measured definitively is another matter. Acoustics is a field where precise measurement is possible, but where the interaction of many variables simultaneously makes clear conclusions difficult. Some researchers have conducted studies comparing the acoustic properties of historical instruments at different tunings and found differences that they consider meaningful. Others have examined the same instruments and concluded that the differences are too small to draw firm conclusions. The debate is ongoing, and the evidence is not yet conclusive enough to settle it. And yet the physical differences in construction remain. They are not theoretical. They are not inferred from documents or reconstructed from incomplete records. They are present in the instruments themselves, visible to researchers who examine them today. The thinner wood, the lighter bracing, the neck angles. These are measurable physical characteristics that consistently point toward a lower tuning environment. This is not a matter of interpretation in the same way that historical documents can be interpreted differently depending on one's perspective. The instruments were built a certain way, and that way is inconsistent with modern pitch. This raises the question of what was understood by the craftsmen of that period that may not be fully reflected in how we think about instrument construction today. The modifications made to old instruments in the 19th century solved a practical problem. They allowed the instruments to survive at higher pitch. But solving a practical problem is not the same as understanding what was lost in the process. If an instrument's original construction was optimized for a specific acoustic relationship that functioned best at lower pitch, then modifying it to work at higher pitch may have preserved the instrument's ability to produce sound while altering something subtler about how it produces that sound. Some musicians who have played historical instruments in their unmodified state, or in instruments built to historical specifications, describe the experience as noticeably different from playing modern instruments at 440. They describe a quality of resonance that feels different, more open in some descriptions, warmer in others. These are subjective observations, and subjective impressions are not the same as scientific evidence, but they are consistent enough across different musicians and different instruments to suggest that something real is being described, even if its precise nature has not yet been captured in measurement. And this is where the question that this chapter opens cannot yet be closed. If the old instrument makers were building deliberately for a lower pitch, and if their construction choices reflect an optimization for that acoustic environment, then what exactly were they optimizing for? What did they understand about the relationship between pitch, wood, tension, and resonance that led them to build instruments so specifically calibrated for something lower than the modern standard? The answer to that question is not clearly explained anywhere in the standard account of tuning history. It remains open, and it is a question that the physical evidence insists on asking, regardless of whether the historical record is prepared to answer it. There's a point in any investigation where individual pieces of evidence stop feeling like isolated observations and start forming something larger. A shape, a direction, not a conclusion yet, but a pattern that is consistent enough to demand explanation. That point, in this particular investigation, arrives when you look across multiple types of historical sources simultaneously and notice that they are all pointing the same way. The first type of source is physical, and in some ways it is the most direct evidence available. Tuning forks. These were the precision tools of the musical world before electronic tuners existed. A tuning fork is a simple object, a two-pronged metal instrument that, when struck, vibrates at a specific and fixed frequency. That frequency does not change over time. It is determined by the physical dimensions of the fork when it was made, and it remains stable for centuries as long as the metal is not significantly damaged or altered. This makes old tuning forks extraordinarily valuable as historical evidence. They do not need to be interpreted the way a written document does. They do not depend on translation or context. You strike them, you measure the frequency, and you know exactly what pitch they were built to produce. Researchers and instrument historians have located surviving tuning forks from the 18th and 19th centuries in museums, private collections, and institutional archives across Europe. These forks came from different countries, different decades, and different musical contexts. Some belonged to orchestras. Some were used by instrument makers. Some were the personal tools of individual musicians. When researchers measured the frequencies of these surviving forks, what they found was consistent across a wide range of sources. The pitches were below 440. In many cases, the forks measured around 430 Hz. Some measured lower than that. Very few approached 440, and those that did were typically from the later part of the 19th century, when pitch had already begun drifting upward in certain regions. This is not a small or ambiguous dataset. It is a repeating pattern across different countries, different time periods, and different types of musical institutions. The tuning forks that musicians actually used to set their instruments before performance, the real-world tools of the real-world musical practice of those centuries, consistently point toward a pitch environment that sat well below the modern standard. This physical evidence does not rely on anyone's interpretation or preference. It is simply what those objects measure when you test them today. But this is where it becomes unclear, because physical evidence alone does not explain why things were the way they were or how they changed. For that, you need to look at the written record. And the written record from the same period adds another dimension to the picture that is equally consistent, and in some ways more striking. When you read the letters, memoirs, and published writings of musicians from the 18th and 19th centuries, a particular complaint appears with notable frequency. The complaint is about pitch rising, not about pitch being inconsistent, though that complaint also exists, but specifically about pitch moving upward over time and the problems that movement was causing. This was not a minor technical grumble confined to a small group of specialists. It was a recognized and recurring issue, discussed openly in musical circles and addressed in the published writings of serious performers. The problem was felt most acutely by singers. The human voice is not an instrument that can be mechanically adjusted the way a string can be tightened or loosened. A singer's range is determined by physiology. The notes that a soprano or tenor can comfortably reach are set by the physical characteristics of their vocal cords and the structures around them. When the pitch of an orchestra rises, the demands placed on singers rise with it. A note that sat comfortably within a singer's range at one pitch reference becomes harder to reach and harder to sustain when the orchestra is tuned higher. This is not a subtle or theoretical concern. It is a direct physical strain. The accounts of singers struggling with this problem during the 18th and 19th centuries are numerous, and they are not vague or impressionistic. They are specific, named performers describing specific situations in which the rising pitch of orchestral tuning was creating difficulties that affected their ability to perform the repertoire as written. The documentation exists, and it is consistent with everything else the physical evidence suggests about the direction in which pitch was moving during this period. One case that appears in historical accounts with particular clarity involves the soprano Adelina Patti, one of the most celebrated singers of the 19th century. Patti reportedly refused to perform with orchestras unless they agreed to tune down from whatever elevated pitch they were using. This was not an occasional preference. It was a condition she applied consistently and with enough force that orchestras accommodated it when they wanted her to perform. She was not alone in this stance. Other prominent singers of the period made similar demands or expressed similar frustrations in their written correspondence. The problem was widespread enough that it was discussed in musical journalism and in the proceedings of the professional organizations that were beginning to push for standardization. At first, this seems like it simply confirms what was already known, that pitch was rising and that this was causing practical difficulties. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because if the rise in pitch was causing documented problems for singers, and if those problems were widely recognized and openly discussed, then the question becomes why the rise continued. Why did orchestras keep tuning higher if the consequences for vocal performance were already well understood? Some explanations have been offered. One is that orchestral musicians, particularly string players, had an incentive to prefer higher pitch. Higher tuning gives string instruments a brighter, more penetrating quality. In large and increasingly competitive concert halls, the pressure to project sound powerfully may have pushed orchestras to favor higher tuning references, regardless of the consequences for other performers. Another explanation points to instrument manufacturers. There was a commercial incentive to build instruments that could sustain higher tension and produce more brilliant sound. Manufacturers who produced instruments optimized for higher pitch could market them as more powerful and more modern. These explanations are plausible, but they are also incomplete. They describe pressures that might contribute to a gradual upward drift, but they do not fully account for why that drift moved consistently in one direction over such an extended period and across so many different countries and contexts. If the problem was simply competition between performers and ensembles, you might expect the drift to vary, higher in some places, lower in others, with natural corrections when the strain became too great. But the pattern in the historical record, across the tuning forks and the written accounts, is not random variation. It is directional movement, upward over time, with complaints following it every step of the way. This raises a question that the standard explanation does not address in any detail. Where exactly was the pressure to raise pitch coming from? Not in the sense of which general forces, competition, commerce, the desire for a brighter sound, but in the more specific sense of which institutions, which decisions, and which moments drove the movement. The gradual rise in pitch across the 18th and 19th centuries is documented. The complaints about it are documented, but the precise mechanisms that sustained that rise, in the face of consistent and well-documented opposition from singers and others, are not clearly explained. And this connects back to the tuning forks in a way that is worth pausing on. If the pitch environment of the 17th and 18th centuries was genuinely centered around 415 to 430 Hz, as the surviving forks consistently suggest, and if the movement upward from those pitches was already generating documented complaints before 1939, then the selection of 440 as the international standard was not a stabilization of existing practice. It was a formalization of a trend. It took the direction in which pitch had been moving, against the preferences of many musicians and against the historical center of gravity of the preceding centuries, and made it the permanent official reference. Whether that was the intention of those involved in the 1939 decision is a separate question. It is possible that the delegates working in London were simply responding to the practical realities of what orchestras were already doing at that moment, without any deliberate intention to favor the upward trend over the historical average. But the effect, regardless of intention, was to lock in a number that represented the continuation of a controversial drift rather than a return to the center of a longer historical practice. Some researchers believe this distinction matters enormously. Others argue that what matters is simply that a standard exists and that music has functioned effectively within it. Both positions have merit, but the evidence from the tuning forks and the written records of the period makes one thing clear. The movement toward higher pitch was not a neutral or uncontested development. It was something that many musicians experienced as a problem and resisted when they could. The pressure that drove it was real, persistent, and moved consistently in one direction. Where that pressure originated and why it proved strong enough to override the objections of the singers and others who documented their concerns so clearly is something the standard historical explanation has not yet fully addressed. The pattern in the evidence is visible. The source of the pressure behind it remains, in important ways, unexplained. There's a difference between a standard that exists on paper and a standard that exists in practice. These two things are often assumed to be the same. When an international agreement is reached, when a number is formally adopted, when institutions sign on and governments acknowledge the decision, the assumption is that the matter is settled. The standard becomes the reality. But in the case of 440 Hz, the distance between the official record and actual musical practice has never fully closed. And that gap, which has persisted for decades, raises questions that are worth examining carefully. The 1939 agreement was adopted. It was real. But in the years that followed, orchestras around the world did not simply align themselves to the new number and move on. Some continued using the references they had always used. Others adjusted partially. The transition was uneven, and in some cases it never fully happened at all. This is not a minor footnote. It means that the standardization project, which was already complicated before the Second World War interrupted it, remained incomplete long after the war ended and the agreement was theoretically in force. One of the most well-known examples of this ongoing variation is the Vienna Philharmonic. The Vienna Philharmonic is one of the most respected orchestras in the world, with a history and a sound identity that it has guarded carefully across generations. And for much of its modern history, the Vienna Philharmonic has tuned not to 440, but higher. In some periods, their reference pitch has been closer to 443 Hz. This is not a small deviation. It is a conscious choice, made by musicians who are aware of the standard and have chosen to operate above it. The Vienna Philharmonic is not an outlier. Other major European orchestras have settled at different reference points as well, some slightly above 440, some at exactly 440, and the variation between them is audible in certain contexts, particularly when musicians from different orchestral traditions play together. This raises an immediate question. If the standard is 440, and if that standard was adopted internationally in 1939, why do some of the most prominent orchestras in the world still tune to something different? Part of the answer has to do with tradition and sound preference. Part of it has to do with the fact that the 1939 agreement, while influential, was never enforced in any binding way. There was no mechanism to compel orchestras to comply. The standard was a recommendation, a reference point, not a regulation. And so institutions with strong sonic identities and long histories of their own preferences simply continued doing what they had always done. But this is where it becomes unclear. Because if the standard was never fully adopted in practice, then what exactly was standardized? The answer seems to be that 440 became a reference point for certain industries and technologies, broadcast systems, electronic tuners, instrument manufacturing at an industrial scale, while remaining optional for live musical performance. The result is a situation where the same number is described as an international standard and simultaneously ignored by a significant portion of the professional musical world. That inconsistency has never been fully resolved, and it is rarely discussed openly. And this connects to a more specific problem that a number of researchers and acousticians have raised in recent decades. The question is not only whether 440 is followed consistently, but whether it was the right choice to begin with. Not in a subjective sense, not in the sense of which pitch sounds better or feels more natural, but in a more technical sense. Different frequencies have different physical properties. Sound is not a uniform phenomenon. The way of vibration at one frequency moves through air, interacts with physical spaces, and affects the structures it passes through is not identical to the way a vibration at a different frequency behaves. This is not a disputed point. It is basic acoustics, and it is measurable. The question being raised is whether the people who selected 440 Hz in 1939 gave any meaningful consideration to these acoustic properties. When you look at the surviving documents from that meeting, the discussion appears to have been focused on practical and administrative concerns. How do you coordinate broadcast frequencies across national radio systems? How do you create a reference that instrument manufacturers across different countries can build to consistently? How do you produce a standard that can be verified and transmitted reliably using the technology available at the time? These were legitimate and serious questions, but they were engineering questions and coordination questions. They were not questions about the acoustic experience of people listening to music. At first, this seems like a reasonable way to approach the problem. Standardization efforts are practical by nature. You solve the coordination problem first, and the finer questions can be addressed later. But the difficulty is that the acoustic experience of the listener was apparently not considered at all, not as a secondary concern, not as something to be revisited, but simply as something outside the frame of the discussion. The delegates in London in 1939 were trying to solve a technical problem, whether the number they chose had any particular acoustic significance, or whether a different number might have been more appropriate for reasons unrelated to broadcast engineering, does not appear to have been part of the conversation. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the absence of that consideration is not, on its own, evidence of a problem. It is entirely possible that the acoustic properties of 440 versus 432, or 438, or 444 are so minor, in practical terms, that they do not meaningfully affect the listening experience in any way that would have been relevant to the decision. Some acousticians argue exactly this. The differences between nearby frequencies, they say, are subtle enough that they fall well within the range of natural variation in any real performance environment, and the idea that one specific number has special acoustic properties that make it categorically different from its neighbors is not supported by the evidence. But others disagree, and the disagreement is not entirely without basis. Some researchers have pointed to studies suggesting that certain frequencies interact differently with human physiology, with the structures of the inner ear, with the resonance properties of the body, with the way the nervous system processes sound. These claims are more contested. The evidence is less consistent, and the methodology of some of the studies that have been cited in this debate has been questioned. It does not make sense to treat these claims as established facts, but it also does not make sense to dismiss them entirely, because the honest answer is that this question has not been studied as carefully or as systematically as it probably should have been. And this points to something worth pausing on. The decision made in 1939 has shaped the pitch environment of almost all recorded and broadcast music for nearly a century. It has influenced the design of instruments, the calibration of electronic tuners, the way music is taught, and the way performances are produced and distributed globally. That is an enormous and lasting influence for a decision that, by the available evidence, was made primarily on the basis of technical convenience and without significant consideration of the acoustic dimensions of the choice. Whether those acoustic dimensions matter is genuinely disputed, but the fact that they were apparently not considered at all is itself an interesting gap in the reasoning. Some researchers have described this gap not as a deliberate omission, but as a reflection of the limitations of the moment. In 1939, the science of acoustics and its relationship to human perception was less developed than it is today. The tools available for studying how different frequencies affect listeners were limited. The people in that room were doing what they could with what they had, and solving the coordination problem was the most urgent task in front of them. This is a fair point, and it probably explains a great deal about why the meeting went the way it did. But the question does not belong only to 1939. It belongs to every decade since then in which the standard has been reviewed, discussed, or reaffirmed. The International Organization for Standardization formalized 440 Hz as the global standard in 1955. That process involved its own discussions and its own set of decisions. Whether the acoustic questions that were apparently absent in 1939 were considered more carefully in 1955, or in any subsequent review, is something the available records do not make entirely clear. What is clear is that the standard has remained unchanged, and that the conversation about whether it should be reconsidered has remained largely outside the mainstream of professional musical or scientific discussion. The pattern across all of this evidence points in a consistent direction. A decision was made for practical reasons, under time pressure, in a specific historical moment. That decision became a global standard. The standard was never fully adopted in practice by a significant portion of the musical world. The acoustic reasoning behind the specific number chosen was apparently limited or absent, and the questions that were not asked in 1939 have not been systematically asked since. Whether any of this means the standard is wrong is a different question entirely, but it does mean the standard was arrived at in a way that left certain things unexamined. And those unexamined things have not gone away simply because the number was written down and agreed upon. When you spend enough time with a historical question, you begin to notice that the explanations available for it are not all the same kind of explanation. Some are careful and evidence-based. Some are speculative but reasonable. Some reach further than the evidence supports. And some exist in a space that is difficult to evaluate cleanly, because the tools needed to test them properly have not been applied with enough consistency or rigor. The question of why 440 Hz became the global standard sits at the intersection of all of these. There's no single explanation that accounts for everything. There are several, and they point in different directions, and none of them is fully satisfying on its own. The first perspective is the most straightforward, and in many ways it is the most defensible. Some musicians, historians, and researchers look at the history of pitch standardization and see something that is complicated and inconsistent, but not particularly mysterious. Tuning was never uniform. Different countries used different references. Different institutions had their own preferences. The variation was real, but it was also a practical inconvenience in a world that was becoming more connected through broadcasting and recording technology. A number needed to be chosen. Discussions happened. Administrative decisions were made. The number 440 emerged from that process, and the reasons were largely practical. The old instruments are interesting. The historical variation is real, but the differences between 432 and 440 are small enough, on this view, that treating them as something significant is reading more into the evidence than the evidence actually supports. This is a reasonable position. It is grounded in a straightforward reading of what the documents show and what the technical differences actually amount to. But it also has a gap in it, because if the choice was purely administrative and the differences were genuinely minor, it becomes harder to explain why the process of reaching a standard took as long as it did, involved as much disagreement as it did, and resulted in a number that was never fully adopted in practice by a significant portion of the professional musical world. Minor administrative decisions do not usually generate that much friction. The simplest explanation accounts for the outcome, but does not fully account for the process that produced it. The second perspective focuses less on the administrative side of the decision and more on the commercial and industrial forces that shaped the pitch environment before 1939. This view holds that the gradual upward drift in pitch across the 18th and 19th centuries was not accidental and not simply the result of competitive pressure between performers. It was driven, at least in part, by the needs and incentives of specific industries. As concert venues grew larger across the 19th century, the demand for instruments that could project sound powerfully into bigger spaces increased. Higher tuning produces a brighter, more penetrating sound from string instruments in particular. Instrument manufacturers who built for higher pitch could market their products as more powerful and more suitable for the modern concert hall. There was a commercial logic to the upward drift, and that logic did not disappear when the standardization discussions began. On this reading, the selection of 440 in 1939 was not a neutral compromise between competing options. It was the formalization of a trend that had already been shaped by industry interests over the preceding century. The standard did not emerge from a careful evaluation of which pitch reference was best suited to musical or acoustic needs. It emerged from a process in which the pitch that industry had already pushed toward became the pitch that international agreement locked in permanently. This is where it becomes unclear, because the documentary evidence from the 1939 meeting does not clearly confirm or deny this interpretation. The discussions were practical. The participants were responding to existing realities. Whether those existing realities had themselves been shaped by commercial pressure is a question the documents do not answer directly. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the second perspective is plausible, and it is consistent with the historical pattern of rising pitch and the complaints that followed it. But it is also incomplete in a specific way. It explains why pitch drifted upward. It does not fully explain why 440 specifically, rather than 438 or 441 or some other nearby number, became the permanent reference. If the standard was simply following where industry had pushed the pitch, you might expect the chosen number to reflect more precisely what major orchestras and manufacturers were actually using at the time. But the evidence suggests that pitch practice in 1939 was still variable enough that 440 was not simply the universal reality being formalized. It was one point within a range of existing practices, and the reasons it was chosen over the others are not entirely clear from the record. The third perspective is the most contested, and it requires the most careful handling. In certain music communities, and occasionally in discussions at the edges of acoustic research, a claim has circulated that specific frequencies carry properties that affect how sound interacts with human physiology in ways that go beyond simple hearing. Proponents of this view argue that 432 Hz, which some historical evidence and some surviving tuning forks point toward as a common reference in earlier centuries, has characteristics that are meaningfully different from 440. The claims vary in their specifics. Some focus on mathematical relationships between 432 and natural ratios found in physical systems. Some point to claimed effects on the nervous system or on the subjective experience of listening. Some connect 432 to older theoretical frameworks about the relationship between music and the natural world. At first, this seems like a claim that should be easy to evaluate. Either a specific frequency has measurable physiological effects that differ from nearby frequencies, or it does not. But this is where the difficulty becomes apparent. The research that would be needed to test these claims cleanly and systematically has not been done at a scale or with a methodology that produces clear conclusions. Some small studies have been conducted. The results have been mixed. The methodology of several of the most frequently cited studies has been questioned by other researchers. The claim is neither proven nor definitively disproven. It exists in a space where the evidence is too limited and too inconsistent to support a firm conclusion in either direction. What makes this perspective worth noting, even in that uncertain state, is not that it is likely to be correct. It may not be. But the fact that this question, whether the specific frequency of a global standard has any relevance to the physiological or perceptual experience of listeners, has not been studied carefully is itself an observation worth making. A standard that affects the pitch of virtually all recorded and broadcast music globally for nearly a century is the kind of decision whose acoustic and physiological dimensions probably deserve more systematic attention than they have received. The absence of that research does not prove anything about 440, but it does leave a space where questions can accumulate without being answered. None of these three perspectives, taken on its own, accounts for the full picture. The first explains the outcome, but not the friction. The second explains the trend, but not the specific number. The third raises questions that have not been tested carefully enough to resolve. Together, they cover different parts of a story, but they also leave different parts open. And what is notable about that situation is not simply that the explanations are incomplete. Incomplete explanations are normal in historical research. What is notable is that the gaps in each explanation point toward the same underlying absence. There is no clear account of why this specific number, at this specific moment, became the permanent and global reference. This raises a question that sounds simple, but turns out to be surprisingly difficult to answer. Who, exactly, decided that 440 was the right number? Not in the sense of which delegates were in the room in London in 1939, but in the deeper sense of where the number came from before it arrived at that meeting. The discussions in 1939 were working with a number that already had some institutional momentum behind it. The German radio system had adopted 440 in 1939. Some earlier standardization discussions had pointed toward 440, but tracing back the precise origin of that number, why 440 rather than something else, and whose interests or preferences first put it on the table, is harder than it should be given how consequential the decision turned out to be. The historical record is not silent on this. There are documents. There are records of earlier discussions, but the record is fragmentary enough that the full chain of reasoning behind the selection of 440 is not easily reconstructed. Some of the relevant institutional archives have not been studied systematically. Some of the discussions that shaped the pre-1939 momentum behind 440 were informal enough that they were not fully documented. The result is a situation where the most consequential pitch decision in modern musical history is supported by a documentary record that does not fully explain its own reasoning. Some researchers find this unremarkable. Decisions made under practical pressure in complicated historical moments are often poorly documented. The people involved were solving immediate problems, not writing histories of their own decision-making. The gaps in the record reflect the normal messiness of institutional processes, not anything more significant than that. This is probably true, at least in part, but the pattern across all three perspectives is consistent in one respect. Each one identifies something that the standard history of 440 does not fully explain. The administrative view leaves the friction unexplained. The commercial view leaves the specific number unexplained. The physiological view leaves a research gap that has never been properly closed. These are different kinds of gaps, pointing at different parts of the question, but they all point at the same central fact. The decision that shaped the pitch of modern music was made in a moment, for reasons that seemed sufficient at the time, and the full account of why it happened the way it did has never been completely written. There is a particular kind of uncertainty that appears at the end of a careful investigation. It is not the uncertainty of having found nothing. It is the uncertainty of having found enough to see the shape of something, but not quite enough to name it precisely. That is where this investigation arrives, not at a conclusion, and not at an empty wall, but at a specific and defined gap between what the official record says and what the broader evidence suggests. That gap is not enormous, but it is consistent, and consistency in historical research is the thing that keeps a question alive. The standardization of A at 440 Hz is a real event. That much is not in dispute. The 1939 meeting in London happened. The delegates were real. The documents exist. The practical problems they were trying to solve, inconsistent pitch references across national broadcasting systems, variation between instrument manufacturers, the difficulty of coordinating international musical exchanges, were genuine problems that genuinely needed addressing. No serious researcher disputes this. The administrative case for standardization was sound, and the process that produced the 1939 agreement was a legitimate institutional response to a real coordination problem. Starting from that foundation is important, because it keeps the investigation grounded in what is actually known. But within that documented reality, a specific question remains. Why 440? The agreement was real. The need for a standard was real. But the selection of this particular number, rather than a nearby alternative, is the part of the story that the available documentation does not fully explain. And when you examine the details of that choice carefully, the explanation that is usually offered, that 440 was a practical compromise reflecting existing practice, becomes harder to accept without qualification, because the existing practice in 1939 was not uniform enough to make 440 the obvious center of what orchestras were actually doing. It was one point within a range, the reasoning that made it the chosen point, rather than another point within the same range, is not clearly laid out in the public record. This is where it becomes unclear, because the historical evidence that surrounds this decision points in a consistent direction that sits below 440, not at it. The surviving tuning forks from the 18th and 19th centuries, physical objects whose frequencies do not change and do not need to be interpreted, consistently measure at pitches below the modern standard. Many of them cluster around 430 Hz. Some are lower. The written accounts from the same period document musicians and singers pushing back against rising pitch, describing specific difficulties caused by orchestras tuning higher than the vocal range comfortably supported. The pattern in the physical evidence and the pattern in the written record point the same way. The historical center of gravity of European musical practice, for most of the period before standardization, was not at 440. It was below it. This does not mean 440 was an unreasonable choice. Pitch had been rising for over a century before the 1939 meeting. By the time the delegates gathered in London, many orchestras were already operating at or near 440, and some were tuned even higher. Choosing 440 was, in a practical sense, choosing a number that reflected where a significant portion of contemporary practice had already arrived. But at first this seems like a straightforward justification, and then a problem appears. If the standard was simply formalizing existing practice, it was formalizing the endpoint of a trend that had generated consistent and well-documented opposition for over 100 years. The singers who complained about rising pitch in the 19th century, the performers who demanded orchestras tuned down, the researchers who noted the discrepancy between rising orchestral pitch and historical instrument construction, all of that resistance was on the record before 1939. The decision to formalize 440 rather than a lower number was, in effect, a decision to side with the trend over the objections. Whether that was a conscious choice or simply a reflection of where practical reality had arrived is genuinely uncertain. The documents do not reveal deliberate intent to override the historical average or to dismiss the concerns of those who had argued against rising pitch. The delegates were probably solving the immediate problem in front of them, using the numbers that the current state of orchestral practice made most convenient. But the effect of the decision, regardless of the intent behind it, was to make permanent a number that represented the continuation of a controversial drift rather than a recalibration toward the longer historical center. That effect is documented. The intent behind it remains unclear. And then there are the instruments. The old instruments, the Baroque violins, the historical oboes, the keyboard instruments built in the centuries before modern standardization, were constructed for a different pitch environment. Their dimensions, their string tensions, their bore sizes and key placements were all designed around references that the surviving tuning forks confirm sat below 440. Many of these instruments have been modified over time to function in the modern pitch standard. Those modifications are documented, and they are themselves a form of evidence. They record the practical reality that the instruments of earlier centuries were not built for 440 and had to be altered to operate within it. This raises a question that seems simple, but is not. If the instruments of the preceding centuries consistently point toward a lower pitch reference, and if those instruments had to be physically modified to function at the modern standard, what does that suggest about the relationship between 440 and the longer history of the musical tradition it is now applied to? Some researchers argue it suggests very little. Instruments change. Musical practice evolves. The modifications made to historical instruments are adaptations to a new reality, not evidence of a wrong turn. Others find the pattern more significant. They point out that the modifications required to bring historical instruments up to 440 were not trivial adjustments. They involved changes to the physical structure of instruments that had been carefully designed for a specific acoustic environment. The fact that those changes were necessary is, on this view, a sign that 440 represented a real departure from the pitch world those instruments were built to inhabit. Both positions have some support in the evidence, and neither is fully conclusive. At the center of all of this is a question that sounds straightforward and turns out not to be. Why not 432? Why not 435, which had been the focus of earlier international standardization efforts in the 19th century? The 1859 French Commission that examined pitch standardization recommended 435 Hz as a reference. That recommendation had institutional backing and historical reasoning behind it. By the time the 1939 meeting happened, 435 had lost ground to higher numbers, but it was still within the range of active discussion. The movement from 435 to 440 as the chosen standard is not a large numerical shift, but it is a shift in a specific direction, upward, away from the historical average, and away from the number that earlier standardization efforts had identified as appropriate. The explanation for why that shift happened, and why it happened at that particular moment, is not clearly stated in the documents that survive from the process. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the gap between what the official account covers and what the evidence raises is not a gap that can be filled by simply reading the available documents more carefully. The documents that exist have been studied. They record the practical discussions that took place. What they do not clearly record is the reasoning behind the specific numerical choice, the deliberation, if any existed, about whether 440 was acoustically or historically appropriate, or whether the discussion was entirely about technical and administrative convenience. That absence in the record is not proof of anything. Documents go missing. Informal discussions are not always written down. The 1939 meeting took place in a moment of considerable political tension in Europe, and the institutional attention available for careful archival documentation of a pitch standardization conference was probably limited. But the absence is still worth noting. A decision with lasting global consequences was made, and the full reasoning behind it is not clearly preserved. Some believe this is simply the normal result of how institutional decisions get made under practical pressure. Others find the specific pattern of the absence, the practical justification present, the deeper acoustic and historical reasoning absent, more interesting than the simple archival gap would explain. Neither position can be fully verified from what the record currently shows. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this: the pitch standard that governs modern music was chosen at a specific moment, for reasons that were primarily practical, by people responding to the immediate pressures of broadcast technology and international coordination. The number they chose sat above the historical average of the preceding centuries, above the numbers that earlier standardization efforts had pointed toward, and above the pitch that the physical evidence of surviving instruments consistently suggests was the center of musical practice for most of the tradition's history. The complaints that had followed the upward drift in pitch for over a century were part of the historical record before the meeting happened. Whether they were considered, and what weight they were given, the documents do not clearly show. The world followed the decision. Music was produced, recorded, broadcast, and taught to the standard that was set. Instruments were manufactured to it. Electronic tuners were calibrated to it. Generations of musicians learned it as the natural and permanent reference point for all of Western music. The scale of the adoption is not in question. What remains in question is something smaller and more specific: whether the full reasoning behind the choice was ever clearly articulated, and whether that reasoning, if it exists somewhere in the record, would satisfy the questions that the physical and historical evidence continues to raise. That part of the story has not yet been fully told, and until it is, the question stays open.